Okay, guys. So far we've looked at bivariate data, and then we've gone through the process of graphing that data, right? Creating what we would call a scatter plot or a scatter diagram. Today we're going to look at the interpretation of that data and the plot itself. Okay, so our focus is going to be today again, Unit 5 still interpreting scatter plots. All right. And so before we can actually look at examples of scatter plots, we need to talk about some terms that we would be using to interpret it. Okay. So the first thing we want to look at when we describe a scatter plot is, right, is it a linear relationship? Right? So is it a linear relationship? Right? So the two terms you're going to use here, obviously, is it linear, right? Which the dots will follow a somewhat straight line pattern. Okay, if that's the case, we can call it a linear relationship. Okay, we're looking for that straight line pattern. Not straight liner, just straight line. And then the other would be obviously non-linear. Okay, and that is simply, right, it's going to be either no pattern or not a straight line. Okay, so we've got our first description being nonlinear versus linear. Okay, and it's very easy, right? We're just going to look at the graph and we're going to talk about whether or not, right, it has a straight line relationship kind of revealing itself. All right. The next question then you would ask is what type of association? Okay, what type of association is there? And now these are, association is a term that we can describe, right, using some different verbiage, right? So association, aka correlation, aka slope. Okay, so what kind of association, what type, and we're talking about really the slope of the graph. We're not talking about the correlation in terms of strength. We're talking about correlation in terms of is it going up? Is it going down? Right? Is it not changing at all? Is there really no relationship there? Right. So we've got positive association, right? And that is going to be where our data trends up. Okay, data is trending up. We've got negative association. That is where our data trends down. Okay, and this should be nothing new for us, right? We're just describing slope. The next one though, the no association. Okay, uh, no association, just like slope. It could mean flat, okay, or all scattered, okay, and that'll make more sense here in a second, but it could mean either one of those things, right? To be there be no association, right? So positive, negative, and no association. Those are our two words here we're talking about with regards to association. Um, and then we have the last being evaluating for strength of correlation. Okay, so the strength of our data, okay, in relation to another. So a strong means data follows the path very tightly. Okay, so it's a very strong association or a strong correlation. Okay, and then of course if it's not strong, it's going to be weak. And again, this can be where it loosely follows the trend or scattered. Okay. If it's scattered all over the place, we could almost say there is no strength there, right? It's not weak at all. It's just no strength. But those are that's the verbiage we're looking for today, right? So a linear versus nonlinear. Okay. Then we have a positive, negative, or no. And then we have a strong versus weak. Okay, so that's going to be our terminology for today that we want to use. And your assignment today is going to kind of follow that, in which you're going to be asked about interpreting the graphs. Okay, so you're going to want to use this verbiage in your descriptions. Okay, so let's look at it, just a couple of examples, right? So, and I'm going to zoom in here on these examples so that we can talk about them. Okay, now, so if you look at, right, example number 2 here, or example 1, question number 2, you'll notice, right, that we have all of our data points, right? They are, looks to be, right, trending upwards here. And so in terms of slope, we could definitely say it's positive, right? Things are trending up. You'll also notice, right, they don't necessarily follow in a direct straight line, but for the most part, right, it looks like they are all kind of trending in a linear pattern. Okay, so I would say that is linear. All right, and now we need to kind of think about, okay, how closely are they following that pattern? Is it like spaced out quite a bit, or are things kind of bunched together? And in which case, right, I can look at this one and say, right, if I had to guess, I would say this one is a strong association, right? Because it's just barely off of that center line that I drew. Okay, so everything's kind of tight to the line, in which we can follow that. All right. So then we can look at another example here, example number 3, right? So if you're looking at this one, okay, we're looking at, again, a couple different things, right? First, right, is it linear, right? And it's pretty obvious for this one. It looks like the data kind of goes like that, right? It kind of goes down and then it starts trending back up. So this is a non-linear data set. We don't know what they're tracking, and it doesn't matter. We're just interpreting the graph. Okay. Now, is there a type of slope, right? Is there some sort of slope? Is there an association that I could say here? Well, no, right? In this case, the data is not trending one way or the other. It's changing. So in this case, right, there is no defined association, right? There's no slope there. Now, but the strength, right, does it follow this kind of trend line or this pattern? And kind of, yes, right? This data does seem to fit a defined pattern. And so which case I would say this is a strong, right? Strong correlation. Okay, wherever this data is trending towards, right? As it gets here, it turns around and goes back up. So we don't know, right, what they're tracking, but it looks to be that it is following that path very tightly. Okay. All right. So we can look at another example here, and take number 7 for instance, right? Okay. So number 7 here, right? We've got just kind of scattered dots on the path. So, and the first thing, is it linear? Well, no, right? Not at all. Let's say non-linear relationship. Is it going to have any defined slope? No, right? There is no association between one or the other. We don't know what they're tracking, but again, whatever it is, right? There's no defined pattern here. There's no trend, right? And so the strength, this would be a very weak relationship. Okay. So we've got last one here, and this is number 8. And again, just kind of looking at the data set. So we'll talk about this one in just a second. We're going to define that guy right there in just a second. So for right now, we're going to ignore him. I know that sounds mean, but if you look at it, right, all this data is really tight to that line, that trend line that I'm drawing. We would say this has a negative association because, right, as your X value goes up, right, your Y value is going down. So you've got kind of this negative association. And maybe it's money spent versus money in your wallet, right? So the more money you spend, the less you have in your wallet. You can think about it that way. So is it linear though? And yes, this is a linear relationship for sure. Definitely following that straight line path. Again, ignoring that guy right there. And is it strong? Yes, right? We have a very tight data set, right? We have a very tight data set. So let's talk about this guy right here, okay? This is a very important piece of data, believe it or not. Even though we ignored him, you have to be able to identify him in order to ignore him, okay? Now, on a scatter plot, it's fairly simple, right? You can see this guy is way outside the norm. When we look at, right, what the normal trend would be, it looks like everything kind of follows this pattern. And then you have this one data point that doesn't follow, okay? So that definition, or what we would call that, okay, that for us is what we would call an outlier, okay? And some of us may have heard that term before, outlier. It is just any piece of data that is way outside the trend. Now, there is a much more mathematical way of determining an outlier, okay? And that has to do with statistics and things called standard deviations and those things to that effect, which we're not going to get into too much, right? But we are going to talk about deviations. But as far as determining the outlier on a scatter plot, you can see it's something that's way outside of the norm, okay? So if we're looking at say this graph, okay? We're not prompted so much, but you can see the trend here, right? It's kind of there where the weight of the fruit and the cost, right? The more it weighs, the more it costs. That would be what we would call a positive association. And again, that just kind of goes along with slope. Is this linear? Yes, it's very loose, right? You can see it loosely follows that trend, but it does kind of form that upward pattern. So we would say it is linear. It's following that straight line path almost. Now, the question here is again, the last thing to define, is it strong or weak? And if you look at this, right, none of this data is hugging that line, not all of it, right? It's kind of scattered. It's got some space to it. So there's a weak association, right? There's a weak association there. So we don't want to think about, this outlier yet. Okay, that guy's clearly not fitting the norm. Okay, whatever piece of fruit that is, it's extremely expensive, even though it doesn't weigh very much. Okay, but the trend is, right, the more that it weighs, the more it costs. Whereas this one, right, it's a lightweight fruit that costs a lot of money. He doesn't fit what the norm would be. Okay, so that's where we get that outlier definition. But again, we do have a positive trend going up. It does follow somewhat of a linear path, but it's kind of weak, right? These things are a little scattered around what we would think of as the path. All right. So just looking at that, right? We'll just try to absorb that vocabulary. It's going to be very important as the unit progresses that we're familiar with all of these words. So definitely use them in your assignment, and then continue to try and attempt to use them as we look at different examples. That way you can become really familiar with it and comfortable. And if you have any questions, any problems, any concerns, like always, just shoot me a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. All right. Thanks, guys.